So now we've discussed in pretty substantial detail about some methods of thinking regarding how to interact specifically with the key on a micro level. We've talked about the necessity for the fingers to be able to support the weight of our arm, the importance of a strong dome or arch of support, and a flexible wrist. We've talked about the difference between starting from the key surface or utilizing the area directly above the key to be able to more accurately judge the speed and force of our attack. I'd like to pull the camera back a bit now and look more macroscopically at our joints and how they each serve a unique purpose in overcoming distinct technical challenges at the piano. Let's also look at some examples of areas in repertoire where the pianist would benefit by understanding how to choreograph the movements of these joints most effectively. Let's first examine the finger and the arm. Aren't we thankful that our arms are not one long bone from the shoulder to the fingertip, but rather a series of bones and joints that allow us great flexibility? Within the finger, there are 3 bones and 3 joints, or 2 for our thumb. Because as pianists, we need to oftentimes be able to support a huge weight from our upper body, we need to think of these 3 joints as more or less unbreakable. Then we have our wrists, our elbows, and our shoulders. The great pianists seem to be able to call on the resources of their whole body, depending on the passage or the situation. But for students, how to use these joints, either in coordination with each other or in isolation, is often a point of confusion. The first problematic issue I'd like to discuss that requires a sensitive understanding of what joint to use at what moment is octave playing. There are all sorts of octave passages in piano music, especially of the 19th century and later. Melodic octaves are one such sort, where the primary purpose is really in simply adding more volume, doubling the melody line. I'll play one example of that type of octave playing now from the second movement of Rachmaninoff's Third Piano Concerto. As the virtuoso pianist became an almost heroic figure in the 19th century, octave passages meant to show the pianist's physical skill rather than simply their interpretive artistry, while simultaneously adding dramatic flair to compositions became more and more standard. Here's one famous example from the first movement of Tchaikovsky's Piano Concerto No. 1. Let's now look more closely at 2 examples of octave playing, including the passage that we just heard, that are notorious for giving students difficulty, and see if we can't make overcoming these passages' inherent difficulties a little more formulaic and manageable by thinking about them in terms of what part of the arm to use when. The first difficult section we'll look at is from Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor. Let me play that for you now. Chopin's first ballade is a piece that I'm sure we're all familiar with. It's oftentimes assigned to young teenagers and sometimes students even younger than that, because it's somehow gained the reputation of being less difficult than it actually is. In fact, from the beginning to the end, there are all sorts of substantial technical and interpretive challenges. I cite this specific example firstly because I believe it's an excellent introduction to the different types of octave playing, and secondly, because I've never had a student who's brought it to me without struggling, and I remember struggling myself with it. The glorious return of the second theme of this piece in measure 106 is marked fortissimo. It should be a noble-sounding fortissimo, and as with all of Chopin, everything must sing. This requires a good deal of weight from the upper body, a firm finger, and a wrist that is neither loose nor locked. It's important with this sort of melodic octave playing that we are using the entirety of our arm, all the way from our shoulder blades through to the tip of our fingers. One can imagine the whole arm operating from the shoulder blade as one flexible unit. Now imagine if we chose a different hinge joint, say the wrist or the elbow, rather than our shoulders. Not only would we be limiting ourselves in terms of the amount of sound that we could produce, but the sound quality would also be affected. If, however, we try to apply this same technical approach to the octaves later in this section, as I've seen many a student try to do, one will immediately find that the arm, thought of as a whole unit from the fingertip to the shoulder or even to the elbow, simply does not have the ability to bounce quickly enough to accommodate the speed of the passage. There is a joint of our arm, though, that does have the ability to bounce more quickly, and that is our wrist. It's crucial when playing octaves from the wrist that the elbow stay more or less immobile, thus isolating the movement of the wrist and allowing for a fast bounce. Let's now revisit that challenging octave passage from the first movement of Tchaikovsky's Piano Concerto No. 1. I bring up this example in particular because it requires the kind of bravura octave playing that one would find in Liszt. Here, the pianist must play at a great rate of speed with a tremendous amount of volume, and also very precisely navigate the various skips between intervals. This is a tremendous test of one's physical stamina, coordination, and precision. Is it possible to apply the same sort of strategies to this octave passage as we did with the ballade example? Let's think about this passage, as we always should do with any passage, from a musical perspective first. How do we want to shape it? Tchaikovsky gives us one indication, fortissimo. But if we were to play the whole passage at one dynamic level, it would be quite boring. The excitement of this passage comes not only from the display of bravura from the pianist, but also from the underlying harmonic tension. If we can carefully choreograph what part of the arm we need to use depending on the musical needs of the passage, we can more successfully navigate its difficulties. For the first three octaves in measures 251 and 253, we need to use the whole weight of our body. Not only are these first octaves a passionate outburst, but they directly follow a huge blast of sound from the orchestra. If we were to use just our wrists here, the sound would be covered. As the octaves speed up, it's a good idea to drop our dynamic level Here, we're going for speed, efficiency, and accuracy, not just volume. So as the octaves pick up momentum, we need to use less arm and more wrist. As the harmonic tension builds, most conductors and pianists both make a slight ritardando from measure 256 leading into the middle of 257. Because here the octaves are slowing and the need for a bigger sound is increasing, we can again use more arm and body and less wrist isolation. Then in measure 258, as the octaves once again pick up speed like a snowball rolling downhill, it becomes necessary to transition back to wrist octaves. As one can see, this octave passage is one of the most difficult in the repertoire because it requires both speed, volume, and accuracy. Yet by thinking about this passage from both a physical and musical perspective, and choreographing this section with a greater awareness of how to utilize our body for each individual specific technical need, we can build a roadmap of how to conquer these challenges.